14 kids vanished on a school trip in 2003. 23 years later, what they found changes everything. Before we begin, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now let's dive into the story. My name is Margaret Hale, and I'm 81 years old. I've lived in Clearwater, Idaho for most of my life. It's a small town, the kind where everyone knows your name, where you wave at neighbors from your porch, and where the biggest event of the year is the county fair in July. For a long time, life here moved slowly, predictably. I liked it that way. I was a school teacher for over 30 years before I retired. After my husband passed in 2019, the days became quieter, too quiet sometimes. My daughter lives in Oregon now. She calls every Sunday, but it's not the same as having someone nearby. Most mornings I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the local newspaper. It's become a ritual, one of the few things that makes me feel connected to the world outside these walls. Last Tuesday started like any other. The sun was just beginning to warm the kitchen windows. I was flipping through the Clearwater Gazette online, mostly stories about the new library hours and a bake sale at the church, when I saw a headline that made my hand freeze over the mouse. Abandoned structure found near Old Mountain Route. Possible link to 2003 incident. My heart skipped. I clicked on the article, my fingers trembling slightly. The words swam in front of me at first, but then they came into focus. A hiker had stumbled upon the rusted frame of what appeared to be a school bus, hidden deep in the woods just 16 miles from the old highway. The area had been inaccessible for years, blocked off after a landslide back in 2003. Authorities were investigating. I set my teacup down carefully, though my hands were shaking. I hadn't heard that year spoken aloud in a very long time. Not in the way people avoid talking about it, but in the way you stop talking about something because the pain has settled so deep, words can't reach it anymore. 23 years ago, 14 young people boarded a yellow school bus for a day trip to the mountains. It was supposed to be a simple outing, a chance for them to see the early spring wildflowers and enjoy the fresh air. The bus never came back. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I wasn't on the trip. I had retired by then. But I helped organize school events, and I knew some of those families. I knew their faces. I knew their voices. I knew the way hope drained from their eyes as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, with no answers. Search teams combed the area. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers walked through forests and fields, calling out names that would never answer back. But nothing was ever found. Not a tire track. Not a piece of clothing. Nothing. Eventually, the searches stopped. The news cameras left. The town grew quiet again. But the weight of that day never lifted. It just became part of the air we breathed. I stared at the article on my screen for a long time. My tea went cold. Outside, a car drove past, and I heard children laughing somewhere down the street. And I thought, after all these years, could it really be them? I didn't know yet what had been found inside that bus. I didn't know what it would mean for the families, for the town, or for me. But something inside me knew. This was only the beginning. The article didn't say much more. Just that the discovery had been made 2 days earlier, and that investigators were being cautious about releasing details. They mentioned the year, 2003, and referred to it as the incident that shook the community, as if we needed reminding. I closed my laptop and sat in the stillness of my kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the morning went on as usual, birds singing, a dog barking in the distance. But inside me, something had cracked open. I hadn't thought about that day in a long time. Not intentionally, anyway. It's strange how grief works. At first, it's all you can think about. It fills every corner of your mind, but over the years, it becomes something you carry without looking at directly, like a stone in your pocket. You know it's there. You feel its weight, but you don't take it out. Now, I had no choice. I stood up slowly and walked to the living room. On the mantel above the fireplace, there's a small wooden box. I keep old. Photographs in it, pictures from my teaching days, snapshots of my daughter when she was young, a few cards from students over the years. I opened the box carefully and sifted through the contents until I found what I was looking for. A photograph. It was faded now, the colors washed out by time, but I could still see their faces clearly. 14 young people standing in front of a yellow school bus, smiling. Some were making silly faces. Others stood with their arms around each other. They looked so alive. I recognized a few of them. There was Emma Caldwell. Her mother worked at the post office. And Daniel Reeves. His father owned the hardware store on Main Street. I remembered seeing them around town, the way you remember faces that become part of the fabric of a place. The photo had been printed in the newspaper after they disappeared. Every household in Clearwater had a copy at some point. Some families framed it. Others tucked it away, unable to look at it for too long. I traced my finger along the edge of the picture, stopping at a boy in the back row. He was tall, with messy brown hair and a shy smile. Tyler, I think his name was. Tyler something. He had his hands in his pockets like he wasn't sure what to do with them. I didn't know him personally, but I remembered his grandmother. She used to come to the town meetings in the months after the disappearance, holding a worn notebook and asking questions no one could answer. Where did they go? Why didn't anyone see anything? How does a bus just vanish? Eventually, she stopped coming. I heard she moved away a few years later. I never found out where. I set the photograph on the mantel and stared at it for a long time. How many people in this town still had copies of this picture? How many had tucked it into drawers or boxes the way I had? And how many would take it out again now, just like I was doing? The phone rang, startling me. I walked back to the kitchen and picked it up. Margaret? It was Helen Porter, a friend from church. Her voice sounded tight, strained. Did you see the news? She asked. I did. There was a long pause. They found it, she whispered. After all this time, they found it. I didn't know what to say. Neither of us did. So we just stayed on the line, listening to each other breathe. Finally, Helen spoke again. Do you think they're still? I don't know, I said quietly. Another silence. I have to go, Helen said. I needed to hear someone else's voice. I know, I said. I'm here. After we hung up, I sat down at the table again. The photograph was still on the mantel, watching me from across the room. And for the first time in 23 years, I let myself remember that day. Not as a distant memory, but as something real. Something that had never really ended. The bus had been found. But what else had been found with it? The rest of that day passed in a fog. I tried to distract myself, cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, watered the plants on the back porch. But my mind kept drifting back to that rusted frame in the woods, to the faces in the photograph, to the question that had haunted this town for over 2 decades. What happened to them? By evening, the phone had rung 3 more times. Each call was same. Someone from town who had seen the news, someone who needed to talk, to process, to wonder aloud if this was finally the moment we'd been waiting for. But no one had answers yet. We were all just holding our breath. I made myself a simple dinner, soup and toast, but I barely touched it. My appetite had disappeared the moment I read that headline. Instead, I sat by the window and watched the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Clearwater had always been a quiet town, but after March 2003, it became something else. It became a town that was waiting at. First, the waiting was frantic, desperate. We waited for search teams to find them. We waited for phone calls that never came. We waited for some sign, any sign, that they were out there, that they were okay. But as the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, the waiting changed. It became heavier, slower. It wasn't hope anymore, it was something closer to resignation. We stopped talking about it at the grocery store, stopped asking each other if there was any news. The question was still there, but it lived in the silences between us. I thought about the families who had lost someone that day. Some of them stayed in Clearwater, trying to hold on to the only place their loved ones had ever known. Others couldn't bear it. They packed up and left, searching for a fresh start somewhere far away from the memories. I understood both choices. My own daughter, Claire, had, been 12 years old in 2003. She didn't know any of the kids on that bus personally, but the disappearance affected her deeply. For months afterward, she refused to ride the school bus. I had to drive her to school every morning, and even then, she would grip the door handle tightly, her knuckles, white. She left for college in 2009 and never really came back. Oh, she visited for holidays, stayed a few days here and there. But Clearwater wasn't home to her anymore. It was the place where something terrible had happened, a place frozen in time. I didn't blame her for leaving. Sometimes I wondered if I should have left too. But I stayed. This was my home, these were my people. And even though the weight of that day pressed down on all of us, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The next morning, I woke early and checked the news again. There was a new article, short, carefully worded. Investigators were examining the site. No further details were available at this time. Families were being notified. Families were being notified. I closed my eyes and imagined what that phone call must have been like. After 23 years of silence, to suddenly hear a voice on the other end saying, "We found something." How do you prepare for that? How do you hold yourself together when the thing you've been waiting for and dreading finally arrives? I thought about Emma Caldwell's mother, who still lived on Maple Street. I thought about Daniel Reeves's father, who had kept the hardware store running all these years, even though everyone knew his heart wasn't in it anymore. And I thought about Tyler's grandmother, wherever she was now. Did someone call her? Did she even want to know? I poured myself another cup of tea and sat at the table, staring out at the morning light. The town was waking up. Cars passing by, people heading to work, children walking to school with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Life had gone on. It always does. But for those of us who remembered, who carried that day with us like a shadow, life had never quite moved forward. We were stuck. Somewhere between before and after, between hope and grief, between knowing and not knowing. And now, after all this time, we were being pulled back. The waiting wasn't over. It was just beginning again. 3 days after the first article appeared, the local news finally released more information. I was sitting in my usual spot at the kitchen table when the notification popped up on my laptop. My heart jumped before I even read the headline. Items recovered from 2003 bus site. Families ask for privacy. I clicked on it immediately. The article was brief, almost frustratingly so. It said that personal belongings had been found inside the abandoned bus. Backpacks, notebooks, small keepsakes. Everything had been carefully preserved by the dry mountain air and the shelter of the wreckage. Authorities were working to identify the items and return them to families. But it was the last sentence that made my breath catch. Among the recovered items was a handwritten letter, believed to have been written shortly after the incident occurred. A letter. I read the sentence again, slower this time, as if the words might change. Someone had written something. Someone had left a message. I sat, back in my chair, my hands trembling slightly. For 23 years we had lived with silence. No answers, no closure. Just an empty space where 14 lives used to be. And now there was a voice. I didn't know what the letter said. I didn't know who had written it. But the fact that it existed at all felt monumental, like a crack of light breaking through a door that had been sealed shut for decades. I thought about calling Helen, but I hesitated. This felt too big, too fragile. I needed time to sit with it first. Instead, I found myself reaching for the photograph again. I brought it back to the table and studied each face carefully, wondering which one of them had taken the time to write, which one of them had believed that someday someone would find it. My eyes lingered on Tyler again, the boy in the back with the shy smile, I didn't know why, but something about him stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk. I needed air. I needed to move. Clearwater's main street was quiet, as it usually was on a Thursday. A few people sat outside the coffee shop, and old Mr. Langley was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his barber shop like he'd done every day for the past 40 years. But there was something different in the air. I couldn't quite name it, but I felt it. A tension, a hum of energy that hadn't been there before. As I passed the post office, I saw Linda Caldwell standing near the door, talking to someone I didn't recognize. Her face was pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked older than I remembered, though I suppose we all did. Linda was Emma's mother. I slowed my pace, unsure whether to approach, but before I could decide, she looked up and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she walked. Toward me. "Margaret," she said quietly. "Linda." We stood there on the sidewalk, two women who had lived in the same town for decades but had barely spoken in years. What do you say to someone whose child disappeared? What words could possibly bridge that kind of distance? "I heard about the bus," I said softly. She nodded, her jaw tight. "They called me yesterday, said they found Emma's backpack." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "They're bringing it to me next week," she continued. "After they've finished, whatever it is they do." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood with her, letting the silence speak. 23 years, she whispered. "And now this." She looked at me then, her eyes red and weary. "Do you think we'll finally know what happened?" I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to promise her that the letter, the backpack, the bus, that all of it would bring the answers she'd been waiting for. But I couldn't lie to her. "I don't know," I said gently. "But maybe it's a start." She nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I have to go," she said. I needed to get out of the house for a bit." "I understand." She turned to leave, then paused. "Margaret?" "Yes?" "Do you ever think about them? The kids?" I nodded. "Every day." She gave me a sad, knowing smile. "Me too." And then she walked away, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a long time, watching the street, watching the town that had been holding its breath for over 2 decades. Something had shifted. Something had been set in motion, and for the first time in years I felt afraid, not of what we might find, but of what it would mean to finally know. By the weekend, the entire town knew. It wasn't just the news articles anymore. It was conversations at the grocery store, whispers at church, phone calls that stretched late into the night. The discovery of the bus had opened something in Clearwater, something that had been buried for a long time, and not everyone was ready for it. On Saturday morning, I went to the farmer's market on the edge of town. It was a small gathering, local vendors selling vegetables, honey, homemade bread. I used to go every week when I was younger, but lately, I only made it once or twice a month. As I walked between the stalls, I could hear pieces of conversations drifting through the air. "Can't believe they never found it before. 16 miles, they said. Just 16 miles. Should have looked harder back then." I stopped at a table selling fresh strawberries and reached for a basket. The woman behind the table, Nancy Griffin, someone I'd known for years, gave me a tired smile. "Crazy week, huh?" she said. I nodded. "It is." She glanced around, then leaned in slightly. "My nephew was in the same grade as one of those kids, Daniel Reeves. They used to play basketball together." I remembered Daniel, tall, always smiling, the kind of kid who helped carry groceries for elderly neighbors without being asked. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. Nancy shook her head. "It's been so long, you know. We all thought we'd made peace with it. But now," she trailed off, her eyes distant. "Now it feels like it just happened yesterday. I paid for strawberries and moved on, but everywhere I went it was the same. People were talking. People were remembering. And with the memories came something else, something sharper. Blame. I heard it in the way Mr. Reeves's name was spoken at the hardware store. Some people thought he should have insisted on going on that trip with his son. Others said the school should have had better safety protocols. A few even questioned why the search efforts had stopped so soon. It wasn't fair, but grief rarely is. By the time I got home, I felt exhausted, not from walking, but from the weight of all those unspoken. Feelings finally rising to the surface. That evening, my daughter called. "Mom, I saw the news," Claire said, her voice tight. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. You don't sound fine." I sighed and sat down in my chair by the window. "It's just a lot. The whole town is stirred up. I can imagine." There was a pause. "Do you want me to come visit?" I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "You don't have to do that. I know, but maybe I should. Claire, you have work. You have your life. I'm okay." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, do you ever think about leaving?" "Clearwater?" The question surprised me. Why would I leave? Because it's hard, isn't it? Living in a place where something like that happened, where everyone knows, where you can't escape it. I looked out at the familiar view, the hills, the rooftops, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. This is my home, Claire. These are my people. Even when it hurts, especially then. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then softly, "I don't think I could do it." "I know," I said gently, "and that's okay." We talked for a few more minutes before she had to go. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet thinking about what she'd said. She was right. It was hard. It had always been hard. But leaving wouldn't change what happened. It wouldn't erase the memories or the pain. It would just mean carrying them somewhere else. The next day I decided to go to church. I hadn't been in a few weeks, but something told me I needed to be there. The service was packed, more people than I'd seen in months. Pastor Green spoke about loss, about healing, about the strength it takes to face the past. His words were kind, careful, but I could see the tension in the room, people shifting in their seats, eyes avoiding each other. After the service, I saw Linda Caldwell again. She was standing near the back, talking to a man I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was Paul Hendricks. He used to live in Clearwater, but he'd moved away years ago. His younger sister had been on the bus. I watched as they spoke, their faces serious, their voices low. And then I saw something I hadn't expected. Linda reached out and touched his arm, and Paul pulled back, his expression hardening. "You weren't here," he said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "You left. You don't get to come back now and act like you cared." Linda's face went pale. "Paul, that's not fair." "Fair?" His voice rose. "None of this is fair, Linda. But at least some of us stayed. At least some of us didn't run away." People were staring now. Pastor Green started moving toward them, but Paul was already walking away, pushing past the crowd and out the door. Linda stood there, frozen, her hands trembling. I wanted to go to her. I wanted to say something comforting. But I didn't know what that would be. Because Paul was right in a way. And so was Linda. This town had fractured a long time ago, and now all the cracks were showing. The confrontation at church stayed with me for days. I kept thinking about the look on Linda's face, the anger in Paul's voice, the way the whole room had gone silent. Grief doesn't just fade. Sometimes it hardens into something else. Resentment, guilt, blame, and when been buried for 23 years, it comes back sharp. On Tuesday morning, I got a call from Helen. "Margaret, have you heard about Dorothy?" "Dorothy Miller?" I asked, surprised. Dorothy was in her late 70s, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. I hadn't seen her in months. "She's been asking questions," Helen said. "Going door to door, talking to anyone who'll listen. She wants to know why they didn't find the bus sooner, why the searches stopped. She's not doing well, Margaret." I felt a pang in my chest. Dorothy's grandson, Kevin, had been one of the 14. He was only 13 at the time, a quiet boy who loved to draw. I remembered Dorothy showing me his sketches once, years ago, before it all happened. She'd been so proud of him. "Where is she now?" I asked. "I think she's at the library. Someone said she's been there all morning, going through old newspapers." I hung up and grabbed my coat. The library was a small brick building on Elm Street, tucked between the post office and a flower shop. When I walked in, I saw Dorothy immediately. She was sitting at one of the tables near the back, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She looked thin, tired, like she hadn't slept in days. I approached slowly. "Dorothy?" She looked up, blinking as if she'd forgotten where she was. Then recognition flickered in her eyes. "Margaret," she said softly. "Helen told me you were here." She gestured to the papers in front of her. "I've been reading everything, all the articles from back then, the search reports, the interviews." I pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Her hands trembled as she touched one of the yellowed pages. "Because I need to understand. I need to know why no one found him, why they gave up." "They didn't give up, Dorothy. They searched for months. But they didn't search there," she said, her voice rising slightly. 16 miles away. That's nothing. Why didn't they check that area?" I didn't have an answer. No one did. The landslide had blocked the old route, and the search teams had focused on the main roads, the areas that seemed most likely. It made sense at the time, but hindsight is cruel. "They did the best they could," I said gently. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't enough. We sat in silence for a moment. Around us, the library was quiet, just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of pages turning somewhere in the distance. "I keep thinking," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he was waiting? What if he thought someone was coming and no one ever did?" My throat tightened. I reached over and placed my hand on hers. "Dorothy, you can't do this to yourself. You can't live in the what-ifs." She looked at me, her face crumpling. "But what else do I have?" I didn't know how to answer that, so I just held her hand and let her cry. After a while, she wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "They said they found a letter. Did you hear that?" I nodded. Do you think Kevin wrote it?" "I don't know. I hope he did," she said quietly. "I hope he left something behind. Something that says he was real. That he mattered." "He mattered," I said firmly. "He still does." Dorothy gave me a sad smile, then turned back to the newspapers in front of her. "I just need to keep looking. Maybe there's something everyone missed. Maybe if I read it all again, I'll find the answer." I stayed with her for another hour, helping her sort through the pages, even though I knew we wouldn't find anything new. But it wasn't about finding answers. It was about not being alone. When I finally left the library, the sun was starting to set. I walked slowly down Main Street, watching the town settle into evening. Dorothy wasn't the only one searching. I could feel it in the air. People going through old photo albums, pulling out boxes from attics, rereading letters they'd tucked away years ago. The discovery of the bus had awakened something in all of us, something we'd tried to bury. The need to know. The need to understand. The need to believe that their lives, those 14 lives, hadn't just disappeared without meaning. That night I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out a notebook. I didn't know why, but I started writing down everything I remembered about that day in March 2003. The weather, the conversations, the faces of the families when the news first broke. I wrote until my hand ached, until the pages were filled with memories I hadn't let myself touch in years. And when I finally stopped, I realized something. We weren't just searching for answers about what happened to them. We were searching for a way to forgive ourselves for not finding them sooner. 2 weeks after the bus was discovered, the town held a quiet gathering at the community center. It wasn't official. No press, no speeches, just an open space for anyone who needed to come together. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to stay home, to keep my distance from the raw emotions that were surfacing everywhere. But something pulled me there anyway. When I arrived, the room was already half full. Folding chairs had been set up in a circle, and people sat in small clusters, talking in hushed voices. I recognized most of the faces. Neighbors, old friends, people I'd known my entire life. Linda Caldwell was there, sitting alone near the window. Dorothy Miller sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. A few younger people, siblings maybe or cousins, stood near the back, looking uncomfortable. Helen waved me over and I took a seat beside her. "I didn't think this many people would come," she whispered. "Neither did I." Pastor Green stood up and cleared his throat gently. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I know this has been a difficult time for everyone. We thought it might help to have a space where we could share memories, feelings, whatever is on our hearts." No one spoke at first. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then Linda stood up. Her voice was quiet but steady. "They returned Emma's backpack to me last week." Everyone turned to look at her. "It was blue," she continued. "With a little keychain she'd clipped to the zipper, a butterfly. I gave it to her for her birthday that year." She paused, her hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her. When I opened the bag, everything was still inside. Her notebook, her pencil case, a granola bar she'd packed for the trip. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. I opened the notebook, and on the first page she'd written her name, Emma Marie Caldwell, with little hearts around it. A tear slipped down her cheek. It's the smallest thing, but seeing her handwriting again after all these years, it felt like she was right there with me. She sat down quickly, covering her face with her hands. The woman next to her, someone I didn't know, reached over and gently touched her shoulder. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Dorothy spoke. "They gave me Kevin's sketchbook." Her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear her, but everyone did. "He always carried it with him," she said. "Everywhere he went, I used to tease him about it." She smiled faintly. There were drawings inside, trees, birds, one of our old dog, Rusty. She looked down at her hands. The last drawing, it was, unfinished. Just a few lines, like he'd started it and then stopped. Her voice broke. "I keep wondering what he was going to draw." Someone else stood up, a man I recognized as Thomas Brennan. His nephew, Jake, had been on the bus. "They found Jake's jacket," he said. "It still had a pack of gum in, the pocket, the kind he always chewed. Spearmint." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know why that matters, but it does." One by one, people began to share. Small things, personal things. A watch, a friendship bracelet, a small stuffed animal that had been tucked into a backpack. Each item was a fragment, a piece of a life that had been interrupted, and each one carried a weight that was impossible to measure. When it was quiet again, Pastor Green spoke. "These things they left behind. They're not just objects. They're pieces of who they were, reminders that they were here, that they mattered." I thought about the letter, the one that hadn't been shared yet, the one authorities were still examining. I wondered what it said. I wondered whose handwriting it was in. And I wondered if, when it was finally revealed, it would bring comfort or more questions. After the gathering ended, I stayed behind to help fold chairs. Linda approached me as I was stacking the last few. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." She hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. It was worn at the edges, like it had been handled many times. "This is Emma," she said, holding it out to me. I looked at the picture, a young girl with a bright smile standing in front of a Christmas tree, holding a wrapped present. "She was beautiful," I said. Linda nodded. "She was kind, too, always thinking about other people. She used to leave little notes for me around the house. 'I love you, Mom,' or 'You're the best.' I still have some of them." She slipped the photo back into her purse. I don't know if we'll ever understand what happened that day, but at least now, I have something of hers again, something I can hold. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. As I drove home that night, I thought about all the fragments that had been returned, the backpacks, the notebooks, the keychains and drawings and pieces of gum. They weren't answers. They weren't closure. But they were proof. Proof that 14 young people had existed, that they had lives, dreams, small habits and little joys. And maybe in a town that had lived with silence for so long, that was enough to start healing, or at least to start remembering. A few days after the gathering, I received an unexpected visitor. I was sitting on my front porch enjoying the late afternoon sun when a young woman walked up the driveway. She looked to be in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a cautious expression on her face. "Mrs. Hale?" she asked. "Yes." "My name is Rachel Hoffman. I was Daniel Reeves's younger sister." I stood up immediately. "Rachel. Of course, please sit down." She settled into the chair beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I heard you were at the community center last week, and I wanted to talk to someone who remembers." "Remembers what, dear?" "Daniel, my brother." Her voice was quiet. "I was only 7 when he disappeared. My memories of him are so scattered. Pieces, really. His laugh. The way he used to sneak me extra cookies when Mom wasn't looking. But I don't have the full picture. And now that they've found the bus, everyone's talking about what happened. But no, one's really talking about who they were." I understood what she meant. In all the news coverage and all the conversations around town, the focus was on the tragedy, the disappearance, the search, the discovery. But the people themselves, the individuals, had become shadows. "What do you remember most about Daniel?" I asked gently. Rachel smiled, her eyes distant. "He was patient, really patient. He used to help me with my homework, even when I know he had better things to do. And he played basketball. He loved it. He'd practice in the driveway for hours. He was a good kid," I said. "Everyone who knew him said so. My parents don't talk about him much," Rachel continued. "My dad especially. After it happened, he just shut down. Kept the hardware store going, kept working, but he never talked about Daniel. It was like if he didn't say the name out loud, maybe it wouldn't be real." She looked at me, her eyes glistening. "But I need to talk about him. I need to remember him as a person, not just as one of the 14 who disappeared." We sat together for a long time, and Rachel told me stories, small memories that had stayed with her over the years. The time Daniel taught her to ride a bike, the way he always let her win at board games, how he'd leave funny drawings on her lunchbox. As she spoke, I realized something important. For Rachel, and for others like her, the younger siblings, the cousins, the children who'd grown up in the shadow of that day, the discovery of the bus wasn't just about finding answers. It was about reclaiming the people they'd lost. "Have you talked to your father about any of this?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "I've tried, but he doesn't want to hear it. He says it's too hard." "Maybe it is," I said gently. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." She nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." After Rachel left, I found myself thinking about the different ways grief touches people. For those who were adults when it happened, the parents, the teachers, the community leaders, the loss was immediate and crushing, but for the younger generation, the ones who were children at the time, it was something else. A gap in their lives they couldn't quite name. A missing piece they'd spent years trying to understand. The next Sunday, I saw something unexpected at church. Rachel was there, sitting next to her father. Mr. Reeves looked older than I remembered. His hair completely gray now, his shoulders slightly stooped. But he was there, and his daughter was beside him holding his hand. During the service, Pastor Green spoke about remembrance, about the importance of honoring those we've lost, not by dwelling on how they left, but by celebrating how they lived. When it was over, I saw Rachel and her father talking quietly near the door, and then for the first time in 23 years, I saw something I hadn't expected. Mr. Reeves was crying. Not the silent, stoic kind of tears, but real heavy sobs, the kind that come from somewhere deep inside, from a place that's been locked away for too long. And Rachel was holding him. I didn't approach them. This moment wasn't mine. It belonged to them. But as I walked to my car, I felt something shift in my chest. The voices of those who'd been lost were finally being heard, not just through the items that had been found or the letter that had yet to be revealed, but through the people who remembered them, through the stories that were being shared, through the love that had never really gone away. And maybe, just maybe, that was how healing would begin. Not with answers, not with explanations, but with remembering, with speaking their names again, with letting them be more than a tragedy, with letting them be real. Not everyone in Clearwater welcomed the reopening of old wounds. I first noticed it at the grocery store. I was waiting in line. At the checkout when I overheard two women talking behind me. "I just think it's time to let it go," one of them said. "All this digging around in the past, what good does it do?" "But they found the bus," the other replied. "Don't the families deserve to know what happened?" "Know what? That their kids are gone?" They already knew that. This is just making everyone miserable all over again. I turned slightly and recognized the first woman, Diane Foster. She'd been on the school board back in 2003. Her voice was sharp, defensive. "Some things are better left alone," she continued. "We moved on. The town moved on. Why bring all this pain back?" I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her that we hadn't moved on, that the pain had never left. But I kept quiet and paid for my groceries. Still, her words stayed with me. A few days later, I received a phone call from Helen. Her voice sounded strained. "Margaret, have you seen the town council meeting agenda?" "No, why?" "They're voting on whether to allow a memorial at the site where the bus was found. And there's pushback." "Pushback? From who?" "Diane Foster, for one, and a few others. They're saying it would be a disruption, that it would attract unwanted attention. They want to keep it quiet." I felt a flash of anger. Those families have waited 23 years. They deserve a place to remember. "I know," Helen said quietly, "but not everyone sees it that way." That evening, I decided to attend the Yahizach town council meeting. I hadn't been to one in years, but something told me I needed to be there. The meeting room was more crowded than I expected. Linda Caldwell was there, along with Dorothy Miller and a handful of other family members. On the other side of the room sat Diane Foster and several people I recognized from local businesses, people who valued Clearwater's reputation more than its history. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order and began discussing the proposal for a memorial, a simple stone marker with the names of the 14 who had been lost. Diane stood up almost immediately. "With all due respect, Mayor, I think we need to consider what this memorial would mean for our town. Clearwater has worked hard to rebuild its image over the years. Do we really want to turn that site into a constant reminder of tragedy? What about tourism? What about new families? Considering moving here?" A few people murmured in agreement. Linda Caldwell stood up, her voice shaking but firm. "My daughter's name deserves to be remembered. They all do. This isn't about image or tourism. This is about honoring lives that were lost." Diane's expression hardened. "I understand your grief, Linda, but we can't let emotion dictate policy. We have to think about what's best for the entire community. And forgetting them is what's best?" Dorothy's voice cut through the room, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Pretending it never happened? That's not what I'm saying." "Then, what are you saying?" Dorothy stood, her hands trembling. "Because it sounds like you want to bury them all over again." The room erupted, people shouting over each other, Diane insisting on practicality, family members demanding recognition, Mayor Thompson trying to restore order. I sat quietly. watching it all unfold, and felt a deep sadness settle over me. This was what grief looked like when it was buried too long. It didn't disappear. It festered, and when it finally broke through, it came out messy, angry, and raw. Finally, the mayor called for a vote. It was close, but in the end, the memorial was approved, barely. Diane and her supporters left immediately, their faces tight with frustration. Linda and Dorothy stayed behind, sitting in the empty chairs, staring at nothing. I walked over to them. "You did the right thing," I said quietly. Linda looked up at me, tears streaming down. Her face. "Why is it so hard? Why do people want to forget?" I sat down beside her. "Because remembering is painful, and some people would rather protect themselves from pain than face the truth." "But they were children," Dorothy whispered. "They deserved better than this." "They did," I agreed. "And now, because of you, they'll be remembered. That's something." It wasn't much comfort, I knew, but it was all I had to offer. As I drove home that night, I thought about Diane and the others who had opposed the memorial. I didn't think they were cruel. I think they were scared. Scared of what it meant to acknowledge the tragedy. Scared of the questions it raised about the town, about the search efforts, about the failures that might have been avoided. Scared that if they let themselves feel it fully, they might never recover. But grief doesn't ask for permission, and truth doesn't wait. For comfort, the memorial would be built, the names would be carved in stone, and whether people liked it or not, Clearwater would finally have to face what it had tried so hard to leave behind. The morning after the council meeting, I woke to find a message on my answering machine. "Mrs. Hale, this is Claire. Mom, I'm coming home this weekend. I need to see you. I'll be there Saturday. Love you." I listened to the message twice, surprised. Claire hadn't visited in almost 6 months. Her voice sounded different, softer, more uncertain. Saturday arrived with overcast skies. I spent the morning tidying up, baking her favorite lemon cake, trying not to worry about why she'd suddenly decided to come. When her car pulled into the driveway just after noon, I was waiting on the porch. She stepped out slowly, and I was struck by how much older she looked. Not just physically, though there were lines around her eyes I hadn't noticed before, but in the way she carried herself, heavier, more burdened. We embraced, and she held on longer than usual. "It's good to see you, sweetheart," I said. "You too, Mom." Inside, over tea and cake, we made small talk for a while. Her job, the weather in Oregon, my garden. But I could tell something was weighing on her. Finally, she set down her cup. "I've been following the news," she said quietly. "About the bus. About everything that's been happening here." I nodded. "It's been difficult. I keep thinking about that year," she continued, 2003. I was 12, and I remember being so scared. Not just about what happened to those kids, but about everything. About the world not being safe anymore. She looked at me, her eyes glistening. "I think that's why I left, Mom. Why I never really came back. Because Clearwater stopped feeling like home. It became the place where terrible things happen. My heart ached for her, I understand. But watching from far away, seeing you there, seeing the families trying to find peace, I realized something." She paused. "I've been running from something that was never chasing me, and in the process, I left you alone. Claire, you didn't—" "I did, Mom, and I'm sorry." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have anything to apologize for." "Yes, I do." A tear slipped down her cheek. "You've been carrying this town's grief all by yourself, and I should have been here. Not just for them, but for you." We sat in silence for a moment, our hands clasped together. "I want to help," she said finally, "with the memorial, with whatever needs to be done. I want to be here." I squeezed her hand. That would mean the world to me. Claire stayed for the entire week. Together, we attended planning meetings for the memorial, helped sort through donated flowers and materials, and listened as families shared more stories about the ones they'd lost. But on the 4th night, something shifted. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, when Claire suddenly put down her fork and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Her voice was so serious it frightened me. "What is it?" She took a shaky breath. "I almost got on that bus." I froze. "What?" "The school trip. In 2003, I was invited. My friend Jessica was going and she asked me to come along." Her hands were trembling. "I wanted to go. I even got the permission slip signed. But then, the night before, I got sick. Just a stomach bug. Nothing serious. But I couldn't go." I didn't know what to say. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. She continued, tears streaming down her face, that it was just luck, just chance. "But Mom, I can't stop thinking, what if I hadn't gotten sick? What if I'd been on that bus? Claire." And then I think about Jessica. She went without me, and she never came back. Her voice broke. "I've carried that guilt for 23 years. The guilt of surviving something I was never even part of." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing. I moved around the table and wrapped my arms around her, holding her the way I had when she was small. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "None of it is your fault. But—" "Why me?" she choked out. "Why did I get to live? Why did I get to grow up, have a life, when they didn't?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know." We stayed like that for a long time, her grief pouring out in waves. And I realized something painful. Claire hadn't just been running from Clearwater. She'd been running from the weight of being the one who got away. The next morning, Claire and I sat together in silence, drinking coffee as the sun rose over the hills. Something had shifted between us, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Later that day, we visited Dorothy. She welcomed us into her small living room, where Kevin's sketchbook sat open on the coffee table. Claire looked at the drawings for a long time, then gently closed the book. "Mrs. Miller," Claire said softly. "I knew Kevin. Not well, but we were in art class together once." Dorothy's eyes widened. "You were?" Claire nodded. "He drew me a picture of a bird, a cardinal. I still have it." Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. "He loved cardinals." "I know," Claire whispered. "I remember." Over the next few days, something beautiful began to happen. Claire started connecting people, those who had stayed with, those who had left. She reached out to old classmates, to siblings who'd moved away, to families who'd lost touch over the years. She organized a small gathering where people could share not just their grief but their memories, the good ones, the ordinary ones. Rachel Hoffman brought photos of Daniel playing basketball. Thomas Brennan shared stories about Jake's terrible jokes. Linda Caldwell talked about Emma's love of butterflies. And slowly, a picture emerged, not of tragedy, but of lives. Real, full, beautiful lives that had been cut short but not erased. I watched Claire move through the room, listening, comforting, building bridges between fractured pieces of a community. And I realized this was how healing happened. Not all at once, not with grand gestures or perfect answers, but person by person, memory by memory, connection by connection. The pattern was becoming clear. We couldn't change what happened, but we could change how we remembered it. We could choose to see them not as victims of a tragedy, but as people who had lived, who had mattered, who had left something behind. And maybe that was enough. 3 weeks after the bus was discovered, the authorities called a meeting at the town hall. They were finally ready to share what they'd found in the letter. The room was packed. Every family member who could attend was there, along with dozens of others from the community. Claire sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. Sheriff Davidson stood at the front, a folded piece of paper in a clear plastic sleeve resting on the podium before him. His face was somber. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult time. We've worked carefully to preserve and analyze everything we found at the site, and today we're ready to share the contents of the letter that was recovered." The room went completely silent. "The letter was written by Tyler Jenkins," he continued, age 13 at the time. It was found tucked inside a notebook, carefully protected. Dorothy gasped softly. Several others wiped at their eyes. "Before I read this," Sheriff Davidson said, his voice gentle, "I want you to know that what Tyler wrote is not easy to hear, but it's brave, and it's important." He lifted the plastic sleeve and began to read. Tyler's words were simple but clear. He described how the bus had broken down after the driver took a wrong turn trying to avoid traffic, how they'd waited for help that never came, how they'd stayed together as long as they could, trying to keep each other's spirits up. He wrote about the cold nights, the dwindling food, the growing fear, but he also wrote about kindness, about how Daniel had shared his jacket, how Emma had led them in songs to keep their minds off the fear, how they'd told stories and made promises to stay strong. And then, in the final lines, Tyler wrote something that broke every heart in that room. "If someone finds this, please tell our families we tried. We really tried. And tell them we weren't alone. We had each other. That has to mean something." When Sheriff Davidson finished reading, no one spoke. The weight of those words, the weight of 23 years of silence finally broken, settled over all of us. Linda Caldwell stood slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered to the sheriff. "Thank you for telling us." Others nodded. Some wept openly. Some sat in stunned silence. We were standing at the threshold now, between not knowing and knowing, between wondering and understanding. The truth hadn't brought them back. It hadn't erased the pain, but it had given them voices again. And that changed everything. The memorial service was held on a Saturday morning in late April, exactly 1 month after the bus had been discovered. The site itself was still restricted, so the town decided to hold the ceremony at Clearwater Memorial Park, a quiet place on the edge of town where families had gathered for generations. Claire and I arrived early. The morning air was cool and fresh, and the trees were just beginning to bloom. Rows of white chairs had been set up facing a simple wooden platform. Behind it stood the memorial stone that had been crafted over the past few weeks, a smooth gray granite marker with 14 names carved carefully into its surface. As people began to arrive, I watched them come. Some I knew well, others I hadn't seen in years, parents who had aged far beyond their years, siblings who were now adults with families of their own, friends who had carried the weight of that day in quiet, invisible ways. Paul Hendricks was there, the man who had confronted Linda at church. He stood off to the side, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Linda arrived with her sister, both of them carrying small bouquets of wildflowers. Dorothy came with Rachel Hoffman, the two of them walking arm in arm. Mr. Reeves stood near the back, his shoulders straight, his eyes fixed on the stone. By the time the service began, nearly 200 people had gathered. Pastor Green opened with a prayer, simple, heartfelt, asking not for answers but for peace. Then, one by one, family members came forward to place flowers at the base of the memorial and say a few words. Linda spoke about Emma's kindness. Dorothy talked about Kevin's drawings. Thomas' eyes. Brennan shared a memory of Jake's laughter. Each name was spoken. Each life was honored. And then something unexpected happened. Paul Hendricks stepped forward. The crowd quieted. Linda looked up, surprised. Paul stood before the memorial for a long moment, staring at the names. Then he turned to face everyone. "My sister's name was Sophie," he said quietly. "She was 14. She loved to read. She wanted to be a teacher." His voice wavered. "When she disappeared, I was angry. Angry at everyone. At the town for not finding her. At myself for not protecting her. At people like Linda." He, glanced at her. "Who stayed here, who I thought had moved on too easily." He paused, his jaw tight. "But I was wrong. You didn't move on. You carried it, just like I did. You just did it differently." He looked back at the stone. "I've been running for 23 years and I'm tired." Linda stood and walked over to him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then she reached out and took his hand. "I'm glad you came back," she said softly. Paul nodded, unable to speak. They stood together before the memorial, two people who had been divided by grief finally finding common ground. After the service, people lingered. They didn't rush away. They stood in small groups, talking quietly, sharing memories, holding each other. Claire stayed close to me, her arm linked through mine. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "A place where they could be remembered, where people could come together." I looked around at the faces, some smiling through tears, some simply standing in silence. "Yes," I said, "this is what I wanted." As the sun climbed higher, families began to drift away, but many left flowers, notes, small tokens at the base of the stone. By the time Claire and I finally left, the memorial was covered in color, a testament to lives that had not been forgotten. On the drive home, Claire was quiet. "Mom," she said finally. "Yes?" "I think I'm going to stay a little longer, maybe a few more weeks." I glanced at her, surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "I need to, for me and for them." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'd like that." That evening, as the sun set over Clearwater, I stood on my porch and looked out at the town. It was the same view I'd seen 1,000 times before. But somehow it felt different. Not healed, not whole, but no longer broken in the same way. We had gathered, we had remembered, we had spoken their names, and now, finally, we could begin to let them rest. 6 weeks had passed since the memorial service. Clearwater hadn't transformed overnight. The pain was still there, woven into the fabric of the town. But something had shifted, something quiet and profound. People who hadn't spoken in years were talking again. Families who had left were returning, if only for a visit. And the memorial stone in the park had become a place not just of mourning, but of reflection. Claire extended her stay twice now, helping to organize a scholarship fund in honor of the 14. She'd reconnected with old friends, rebuilt relationships with people she'd left behind, and most importantly, she'd stopped running. One afternoon, she and I drove out to see the actual site where the bus had been found. It had been opened to the public now, with a simple trail leading through the woods. The bus itself had been removed for further study, but a small plaque had been placed where it had stood for 23 years. We walked the trail in silence, the forest around us peaceful and still. When we reached the plaque, we stood together, reading the words engraved there. "In memory of the 14 who journeyed here and never returned home, may they rest in the peace they could not find in life." Claire knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. "Do you think they knew?" she asked quietly. "That people would keep looking for them?" I thought about Tyler's letter, about the hope in his words, even in the face of fear. "I think they hoped," I said. And maybe that was enough. We stayed for a while longer, listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling the presence of something we couldn't see but could sense, a kind of stillness that felt sacred. On the drive back, Claire turned to me. "I've been thinking about moving back," she said. I looked at her surprised. "To Clearwater?" She nodded. "Not right away, but eventually. I've spent so long trying to escape this place, trying to leave the past behind. But the truth is, this is where I'm from, and these are my people." Tears pricked at my eyes. "I'd love that. I know it won't be easy," she continued, "and I know the memories will always be here, but maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what it means to really live somewhere, to carry both the joy and the sorrow." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're wiser than I ever was at your age." She smiled. "I learned from the best." That evening, back at home, I sat at my kitchen table one last time with Tyler's letter, a copy the sheriff had given to all the families. I read it slowly, letting each word sink in. He had been so young, they all had been. But in his final act, Tyler had given us something precious. A voice from the silence, a reminder that even in their darkest moments, They had tried. They had cared for each other. They had held on to hope. And now, all these years later, we were finally able to honor that. The next Sunday at church, Pastor Green spoke about closure, about how it doesn't mean forgetting or moving on, but rather making peace with what was and what will never be. Closure isn't an ending, he said. It's a doorway. It allows us to step forward while still honoring what we leave behind. After the service, I walked through town, past the hardware store where Mr. Reeves now smiled occasionally at customers, past the post office where Linda Caldwell worked with a lightness that hadn't been there before, past the houses where families were learning to live again with both memory and hope. Clearwater would never be the same town it was before March 2003, but perhaps that was as it should be. We had learned something important, that grief, when faced together, becomes bearable, that remembering doesn't have to mean suffering, and that even the smallest voice, like a letter written by a 13-year-old boy, can echo across decades and bring healing to a community. As I walked home, the sun setting behind me, I thought about all the fragments that had been returned. The backpacks, the sketches, the notes, the letter. They weren't answers, they weren't explanations, but they were proof of love, proof of courage, proof that 14 young lives had mattered. And in a world that often forgets, that was everything. I climbed the steps to my porch, Claire's car still parked in the driveway, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace, not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from finally, truly, remembering.